Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, lived a life so layered with drama and intrigue that if you pitched it to a Hollywood producer, they'd probably tell you it was too over the top to be believable. Imagine beginning your life in a kingdom on the brink of revolution, getting smuggled out of your country as a baby, spending your boyhood clinging to royal lineage in exile, and then growing up to marry the future Queen of England in a blockbuster wedding. That's just the first act of an incredible existence, because Prince Philip, for nearly a century, carried secrets, survived tragedies, and juggled more responsibilities than most people could even imagine. He fought in a world war, endured complicated family ties with people on both sides of a brutal conflict, and became a father who struggled to connect with his own children. He spent decades by Queen Elizabeth II's side as her consort, forging a legacy that was at once deeply admirable and occasionally controversial. And that legacy lasted until the final day of his life, which ended mere weeks shy of his 100th birthday. Buckle up, because this story twists and turns like an old-school adventure novel, and yet it all happened. No script needed. A lot of people assume Prince Philip was born in a grand British palace or a countryside estate, but his origins were very, very different. First of all, he wasn't even British. He entered the world on June 10th, 1921, on the Greek island of Corfu, to parents who belonged to two royal lines, the Greek royal family and the Danish royal family. But as romantic as it might sound, birth on a sunlit Greek island with azure waters glimmering in the background, his earliest days were anything but peaceful. Greece was in turmoil. His father, Prince Andrew, faced serious political danger, and his uncle, King Constantine I, had been forced to abdicate. The monarchy found itself on shaky ground, and Philip's family realized that if they didn't act quickly, they might literally lose their heads. The plan was to get out, fast. The crisis escalated to such a dire point that the royal party had no choice but to smuggle young Philip out of the country in a makeshift fruit crate. It's a bizarre and gripping origin story for someone destined to become the Duke of Edinburgh. But that was just the opening chapter of chaos in Philip's childhood. Once the family escaped to France, you might think, okay, they're in a luxurious Parisian mansion. Life can't be so bad. But the reality was a far cry from the storybook vision of well-heeled European royalty. The clans scraped by in far more modest conditions, and troubles continued piling up. Philip's mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, began displaying signs of severe mental illness, eventually believing she had a direct line to divine messages and special healing powers. Doctors diagnosed her with schizophrenia and placed her in a sanatorium in Switzerland. Meanwhile, his father, Prince Andrew, distanced himself from the family, leaving Philip's upbringing scattered among various relatives. Essentially, young Philip was no pampered heir. By the time the Great Depression was swirling across Europe, he was a scrappy kid with a mix of aristocratic manners and streetwise adaptability, shaped by displacement and heartbreak. One of the biggest heartbreaks during his youth came in 1937, when Philip's favorite sister, Princess Cecilia, was killed in a plane crash along with her husband, two of her children, and her mother-in-law. That catastrophic accident was made all the more haunting by the fact that Cecilia had apparently been pregnant, may even have gone into labor mid-flight, and that medical emergency might have led to the plane's disaster. At 16 years old, Philip was left to grapple with that enormous grief on top of everything else he'd faced. Worse yet, tensions in Europe escalated toward World War II, and 4 of his sisters had married German princes, aligning themselves with the Third Reich. Picture the emotional whiplash. He was a teenage Greek and Danish prince, exiled, with many of his siblings on the other side, while he himself would end up fighting for Britain in the war. Confusing doesn't even cover it. If you track his life like a ticking time bomb of improbable events, the next major milestone was his entry into the British Royal Navy in 1939. This young man, who'd had to renounce his Greek homeland, went headlong into service for a country that wasn't even formally his at the time. As war broke out, he served bravely, becoming an officer and seeing action in multiple theaters. And yes, at 18 years old, while stationed at the Royal Naval College, he caught the eye of a bright and decidedly younger Princess Elizabeth, who was just 13 at the time. That age gap today would raise eyebrows. At the time, it was still a little eyebrow-raising, but the monarchy can be a world of old traditions. Elizabeth was completely starry-eyed. By all accounts, from the moment she met him, she had her mind made up that this was the man she'd marry. We can debate what captured her heart: his confidence, his physical stature, his rebellious streak. But it happened. The war raged on. Philip distinguished himself in battle, and behind the scenes, he and the princess maintained a correspondence that gradually morphed into a love affair. Of course, Elizabeth's father, King George VI, had strong opinions about the match. Philip's upbringing was messy. His family had direct ties to Germany, and his brash military style clashed with the more refined environment of the English court. Plus, Elizabeth was so young. The king insisted on caution. No official engagement until Elizabeth turned 21. During those intervening years, Philip parted ways with what remained of his old royal identity. He renounced his Greek and Danish titles, took his mother's more English-sounding family name of Mountbatten, and became a naturalized British citizen. Let's not minimize how monumental that was. He severed the last remnants of his direct ties to the old Greek monarchy. Essentially, he had to reinvent himself, forging a brand new path, and that path led to one of the biggest events in post-war British history, his wedding to Princess Elizabeth on November 20th, 1947, at Westminster Abbey. If you'd been around at that time, you would have felt the buzz of excitement. The war was over, and though Britain was still deep in recovery with rationing and economic hardship, the wedding gave the nation a reason to celebrate. Radio broadcasts sent the ceremony's audio to hundreds of millions across the globe. It was a joyous moment, overshadowed slightly by the fact that none of Philip's German relatives were invited. Several had ties to the Nazi regime and had married high-ranking German princes. The optics were simply unacceptable. It was a stark example of how the personal is always political within royal families. From the outside, the marriage began like a fairy tale, but behind the scenes, there were cracks in the foundation. For one, King George VI did not fully warm up to his new son-in-law. For another, the strong-willed Philip chafed at the constraints of royal life. He'd come from a chaotic background, but had thrived in the autonomy of the Royal Navy. Now, he was expected to walk 2 steps behind his wife, literally and figuratively. The monarchy is nothing if not symbolic, and the image of Philip standing behind Elizabeth would define his role as consort, supportive, subservient in rank, yet formidable in his own presence. Fatherhood arrived quickly. Prince Charles was born in 1948, with Princess Anne following in 1950. Famously, Philip wasn't much for the hand-holding niceties of child-rearing. When Elizabeth was in an excruciating 30-hour labor to deliver Charles, Philip was off playing squash and swimming, dropping by only when he got word that he had a new baby boy. He greeted the news with a quip about the newborn looking like a plum pudding. That might have been charming or lightly amusing in a breezy sort of way, but it also set the tone for how emotionally distant he'd be with his kids. He came from a tradition of tough love, or maybe just tough luck, where you say what you think and push your children to be resilient by any means necessary. This approach would weigh heavily on his family dynamics, especially with his more sensitive eldest son. Then, destiny intervened in 1952. Philip and Elizabeth were on a tour in Kenya when word arrived. King George VI had died in his sleep. Elizabeth ascended the throne as Queen Elizabeth II at only 25 years old. Philip's entire existence shifted. He had to surrender his promising military career. Now, he wasn't just Elizabeth's husband. He was the Queen's consort, expected to reshape his life around supporting her. It was a role for which no blueprint truly existed in modern times, especially for a personality as unfiltered and action-oriented as Philip's. There were immediate tensions. What would their royal house be called? Philip wanted it to be the House of Edinburgh, or at least Mountbatten, but Winston Churchill and others insisted it stay Windsor, the name recognized by the British public. That decision enraged Philip. He famously griped, "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba. I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children."
If you ever doubted the monarchy's ability to cause familial strife with a single pen stroke, there's your proof. Around that time, there were swirling rumors in the tabloids that the handsome, roguish prince might be less than faithful. People whispered about late-night visits to actresses like Pat Kirkwood, who alleged that if Prince Philip had just gone home to his pregnant wife, Elizabeth, instead of dropping by her dressing room, she would have had a far easier life. The palace denied everything, chalking it up to salacious gossip. Philip had a standard line that with bodyguards constantly trailing him, it would be impossible to sneak around. Some insiders believed he was simply a flirt who liked to window shop, as one courtier put it. Others suspected the old rebellious streak was still lurking. Either way, there was no definitive proof that he had actually crossed the line. With the monarchy's penchant for secrecy, it's likely any indiscretions were buried or never existed in the first place. Despite all these tensions, Elizabeth saw that Philip was frustrated. So in 1957, she made him a prince of the United Kingdom. It was a symbolic but significant gesture, acknowledging his importance in her life and his place in the realm. Yet, for a man of action, titles only went so far. Perhaps to channel his energy, Philip threw himself into a dizzying array of activities. He was among the earliest members of the royal family to embrace the concept of modernizing the monarchy's image, pushing for Elizabeth's coronation to be televised in 1953. He authored books on everything from wildlife to environmental concerns. He became the first royal family member interviewed on television. He poured his restlessness into philanthropic projects and passionately supported charities that promoted industry, education, and conservation. But the brunt of his uncompromising personality often landed on his kids. He demanded discipline, especially from Charles, who was far more sensitive, introspective, and artistic than his father. This constant mismatch of expectations fueled tension that would last into Charles's adulthood. By contrast, Philip adored Princess Anne, who shared his forthright, no-nonsense approach. Later, with the births of Prince Andrew, 1960, and Prince Edward, 1964, the family would grow, but so did the complexities of navigating monarchy, fatherhood, and societal change in the post-war era. For all that, he occasionally exuded an old-fashioned paternal approach. Prince Philip had a strikingly modern side. He was curious about technology and science, an accomplished pilot who logged thousands of hours in the cockpit of airplanes and helicopters. He was known to be thrifty, some might say stingy, about personal belongings, famously having a pair of trousers repaired 50 years after he first wore them. He also had a lightning-quick wit that could veer into territory some deemed offensive. "Dontopedology," he once joked, "is the science of opening your mouth and putting your foot in it," a skill he claimed to have practiced for many years. Indeed, he racked up a list of eyebrow-raising comments that either offended or amused, depending on whom you ask. From telling British students in China they'd get slitty eyes if they stayed too long, to calling on British manufacturing to buck up.
He rarely self-censored. In an era when monarchy was under scrutiny, that candor sometimes undermined the polished image Buckingham Palace aimed to project. He also maintained an active interest in environmental issues. Ironic, some might argue, considering the historically lavish lifestyles of the royals. But he was one of the founders of the Australian Conservation Foundation and served as president of the World Wildlife Fund, WWF. He published works on the environment, urging a more mindful approach to man's relationship with the planet. This might surprise those who saw him simply as a crusty ex-naval officer set in his ways. The truth is, Philip contained multitudes, a champion of modern tech and environmentalism on one hand, a man capable of toe-curlingly insensitive remarks on the other. Royal watchers love a good scandal, and for decades they tried linking him with one rumored mistress or another. Those stories never came to anything conclusive, but the sense persisted that behind the palace doors, Elizabeth and Philip had their fair share of arguments. By the mid-20th century, though, they were locked into a remarkable partnership. He accompanied her on tours around the world, shook hands with countless dignitaries, and performed official duties, reportedly more official engagements per year than most younger royals. If he occasionally muttered about hating fussy ceremonies, he still showed up. The monarchy is, at its core, a pageant of duty, and Prince Philip was never one to shirk duty. The next generation of royals brought fresh dramas, none more calamitous than the marriage of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer in 1981. Philip was deeply involved behind the scenes, urging his son to either propose to Diana or let her go, worried about the endless speculation. Charles, feeling pressure from all sides, rushed into the engagement. The wedding was a global sensation, but the cracks soon appeared, culminating in a miserable union. Diana's struggles with life in the royal family, Charles's unresolved feelings for Camilla Parker Bowles, and the unrelenting tabloid coverage led to a fiasco that threatened to demolish the monarchy's reputation. Philip, the father-in-law, wrote letters to Diana, some encouraging her to patch things up with Charles, others expressing bewilderment at how everything had gone so awry. But perhaps the most poignant moment of Philip's entire life came in 1997, when Diana died in that tragic car crash in Paris. The world wept. Britain reeled. The royals faced a crisis as people accused them of not responding with enough public emotion. Prince Philip stepped in quietly but powerfully when it came to supporting his grieving grandsons, William and Harry. Many people recall the heartbreaking sight of those two young boys walking behind Diana's coffin. It was Philip who allegedly took William aside, saying, "If you don't walk, you may regret it later. If I walk, will you walk with me?" The image of a stoic grandfather supporting the motherless princes remains one of the defining moments that showcased his underlying compassion. For all his bluster and pull-yourself-together approach, he understood the weight of heartbreak. He wasn't done shaping the monarchy's path. In the 21st century, Prince Philip continued to maintain a punishing work schedule, sometimes making more public appearances per year than princes half his age. He visited schools, factories, hospitals, supported countless charitable endeavors, and typed up letters from his own desk. There's a story of a White House butler recounting how, on a visit, Philip poured drinks for the staff, striking up a casual chat. He seemed to relish being less formal than the public might assume, though protocol demanded a certain stance. He was unafraid to break down small barriers. If you ever had a conversation with him, you might be stunned by how direct or sarcastic he could be. One of the strangest tributes to Philip is the Prince Philip movement on Tanna, an island in Vanuatu. The local people revered him as a sort of deity, sending him a traditional war club, which he posed with in a photograph he mailed back. That bizarre intersection of monarchy and tribal worship is exactly the kind of footnote that peppers Philip's life, underlining its near-mythic quality. He also supported numerous sporting endeavors. He was a noted carriage driver, often competing in events well into his older years. This fiercely active spirit likely contributed to his longevity. Of course, time and age spare no one. Philip gradually scaled back his official duties, especially after turning 95, but still seemed unstoppable for a while. In 2017, at the age of 96, he retired from public engagements entirely, having fulfilled over 22,000 solo events during Elizabeth's reign. That number doesn't include the endless events they attended together, nor the thousands of speeches and toasts he made. No matter one's view of the monarchy, that level of commitment is remarkable. He once said, wryly, that it was better to get out before he slipped into dotage. The man had a sense of comedic timing to the very end. Then came the final chapter. He experienced health issues, hospital visits, surgical procedures. Even so, in early 2021, as news broke of Harry and Meghan's bombshell interview with Oprah Winfrey, Philip was in the hospital for heart-related issues. Some tabloids tried to rope him into the allegations of racism that Meghan mentioned, but Harry and Meghan clarified that Philip was not the one who commented on the potential skin color of their future children. That was speculation from the press, not from them. His health deteriorated in March and April. On April 9, 2021, Philip passed away peacefully at Windsor Castle, just shy of his 100th birthday. True to form, he had reportedly told those close to him that he wanted no fuss made of his funeral. It would be a scaled-down affair, not a grand spectacle. He'd probably be pleased it aligned with the era of COVID restrictions, forcing a smaller ceremony. Today, some might judge him for his old-school worldview. Others might recall him as a somewhat lovable eccentric who rode carriage races into his 90s. Still others see him as the anchor that helped Elizabeth II become the steady monarch she was. Whatever you choose to focus on, you can't deny that he was one of the most fascinating figures in the modern British royal story. He was the real-life supporting character who occasionally stole the spotlight, an outsider who became an integral pillar of the House of Windsor, and a father whose approach left lasting ripples through future generations of princes and princesses. Prince Philip might not have wanted a big fuss, but when you trace the lines of his life, you realize fuss is inevitable. From Greek prince in exile to British naval hero, from reluctant courtier to pillar of the Windsor dynasty, from stony-faced father to supportive grandfather. He was the ultimate paradox, and for that reason, the story of his life will endure far beyond his passing. The image of him walking in formal uniform behind Queen Elizabeth, occasionally whispering a quip that made her suppress a giggle, remains a quintessential snapshot of the monarchy's human side. Some will remember him for the stiff remarks, some for the unwavering sense of duty, some for the quiet kindnesses he bestowed in unpublicized moments, and some for the controversies he triggered with an unfiltered mouth. But the sum total is that he was real, multidimensional, and braver than most for taking on a job no man before him had truly mastered. And that is what makes him such a compelling figure, a man shaped by global conflict, personal loss, and the constraints of an ancient institution. Yet he carved out a role that he alone defined. He poured thousands of hours into philanthropic efforts, wrote about the environment long before it became a trendy issue, and showed the monarchy, kicking and screaming, how to adapt to a television age. His was not a life of quiet complacency. In the end, it was a life that roared for nearly a century, bridging the distance between a monarchy once threatened by revolutions and a future uncharted. For that, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, deserves his place in the grand tapestry of modern legends, fruit crate and all.